Hello, here I am making another early video this year, and while I have other video essays in the works, I've just been pretty busy so far this year with personal projects and switching up day jobs, but here I am with a video that is scripted but will be unedited. So, about 3 weeks ago, a YouTuber called June the King, who specializes in making lengthy videos about personal, popular internet personas and their rises and falls from grace, made a video on the case of Mr. Enter. The last time I mentioned Mr. Enter was a year ago, only in brief passing for a whole 2 seconds after his you-know-what with a certain movie. Now, I originally decided a while back that I was done with Mr. Enter, but after watching some of his more recent videos, along with June the King's video, I just felt compelled to have one final say on him before officially making peace with him, for my own sanity, as he has been a major influence for me during a period of my life when I was still following him. My relationship with Mr. Enter goes back precisely a decade ago, when I first came across his animated atrocity and admirable animation videos. I tuned into every single one of his videos, got my own DeviantArt account to follow him, and even made a lot of early DeviantArt entries just imitating his style, which I admit I don't look back on with particular fondness. He helped me reconnect with some beloved cartoons of my childhood that I'd forgotten about, as well as helped me discover some new animated gems. At the time, it just felt so good to realize that there were other people out there who recognized animation as a legit art form and were fighting against the stigma that it was just a genre that served only as a distraction for kids. And because I, along with several other grown-up animation fans at the time, felt so unheard, I didn't exactly care when these online reviewers would get so abrasive or overly hyperbolic. I was just concerned with hearing what felt good to hear. In fact, from what I've seen at least, it's only been in more recent years where reviewers online started to care more about takes being made in good or bad faith, as completely separate from how much they personally love or hate a movie or show that's being reviewed. And not that this hasn't always been the case, there's definitely been some of that, but there's a lot more emphasis of it right now. And as such, I've leaned more in the direction of trying to respect all sides instead of treating one like they're always right. Because let's be honest, there's been ugliness on behalf of creators, corporations, and consumers alike throughout history, so I've been trying harder than ever to get into the practice of giving everyone a fair shake. But back to Mr. Enter. The more he initially revealed about himself, from his likes and interests to the fact that he has autism, the more I started to see myself in him. I also had a lot of sympathy for the guy, as he has spoken about the hardships he's had to endure through his life, much more than I can imagine, on top of having autism. Between school, his childhood with his family, his social anxiety, I was rooting for him to be someone who could pick up the broken pieces of his life and make something new and beautiful out of it. For 5 years, he was one of those reviewers I followed closely and tried to be supportive of every step of the way, but maybe to a fault. I wasn't as adamant at first on calling him out on his wrongdoings because, one, I was still somewhat new to the landscape of the internet, but two, because the general impression I got was that he was good at keeping himself in check, or at least trying to, and making amends for his mistakes. There have been some things he said when I was still watching him that didn't sit right with me, and I would try to speak up about them, however minuscule my voice may have been, and I've always sought to do so in good faith. I mean, when somebody makes mistakes, however big they may be, if they're willing to own up to them and make as many amends as possible on their end, that's the least we could owe them as a human being. Of course, as time went on, I've grown more distant from Mr. Enter and his reviews, not only because I found myself disagreeing with him more and more, but rather because it became more and more apparent to me that he's become disillusioned with what is considered disrespectful to the medium of animation, even admitting in his Legend of Korra review that Animated Atrocities was just a brand name more than anything else. To me, this was indicative that he had more personal vendettas against certain tropes and popular scenes in animation, rather than showing actual passion for the medium. And nowhere has this become more apparent than with his hate boner for animated parents, or just fictional parents in general. He's been especially emphatic about how easily triggered he was by movies and shows that reminded him of the abusive family environment he grew up in, with his review of the Family Guy episode Seahorse Seashell Party, and especially his review of Disney's Chicken Little, with the character of Buck Cluck taking the title for his most despised character for quite some time. But he's shown hints of this pattern prior to those reviews, like how he said that his most hated show of all time was Malcolm in the Middle, largely because the character of Lois reminded him too much of his own mother. And the pattern continued when he said in a later journal, like I think in 2015, that Chicken Little was no longer his most hated movie of all time and instead gave that spot to Adam Sandler's That's My Boy, which, wouldn't you know it, also revolves around a bad father-son relationship. Now, that doesn't mean I'm defending movies like That's My Boy or Chicken Little as good movies, and that's also not to say I don't think characters like Buck Cluck or the Griffins in select Family Guy episodes aren't deserving of the scorn they've gotten from audiences. But Enter's particular hatred for cartoon parents was something so personal that rather than figure out how to resolve it healthily, he would just go on and on and on and on about it in his DeviantArt journals, ultimately resulting in his 2017 top 10 worst animation videos, top 10 worst animation cliches videos, saying about parents, even including better examples like, say, Stoic the Vast from How to Train Your Dragon, quote, "I don't know what it is, but it seems like the medium is just drawn to making the worst human beings as possible as parents. Let's pretend that all fathers everywhere are closed-minded to their kids' unusual choices. It's not interesting anymore. You can't interest me in a new story about this concept. This is ignoring the time that one or more parents is dead. It just seems so arbitrary. The death of a parent is always something that affects you, even if it happened to you when you were young. I don't know why animated films and television shows keep doing this beyond cruel sadistic tradition. Maybe they've gotten the perception that all parents in animation are awful, and the only way to remotely give the child character a remotely happy life is to kill them off." Unquote. That last sentence right there was just all kinds of yikes. And his attitude, this was an attitude that only persisted throughout the years, up into his El Tigre review in his Nicorama series, which I covered back in 2020, and even up to his Turning Red review. Never mind the dumb 9/11 take. What I'm talking about, another one of his big points of contention was him constantly dumping on the character of the mom Ming Lee. And this was something that even carried over into what he was writing for his Growing Around series, including his book that he published on Amazon, where kids and parents switch roles and parents are constantly given the short end of the stick. This especially being a case where the titular character Sally, who some have pointed out, ironically looks like a little girl version of Peter Griffin from Family Guy, and she's shown continuously taking delight in looking for ways to torture and humiliate the mom Linda, the most infamous case being, as Dune the King pointed out in his video, being that she's forced to sniff her foul-smelling roller skate. This wasn't even something like a Roald Dahl story where the child protagonist is thwarting an abusive guardian or authority figure to break out from under them and find a better life. It's just child characters gleefully putting down adult characters who, frankly, did nothing to deserve it. Now, I remember reading in at least one of Mr. Enter's DeviantArt journals that he wanted to have kids of his own, and I think he even alluded to this in at least one video that he's made. But it became clear to me that his state of mind was that of someone who should not be having kids. Because these things that he's thrown cartoon parents under the bus for, being overprotective, not trusting their child's intuition, not seeing eye to eye with them, is all stuff that every parent goes through at some stages at some point. Yes, that even includes me and my parents. No relationship under the sun is so pitch perfect and squeaky clean 24/7. We all make mistakes, we all sometimes hurt each other even when we have the best of intentions, we all run into conflict in any relationship we face, and that's how we all learn and grow and become stronger. A guy like Mr. Enter certainly would not make for a good parent who is able to handle these kinds of conflicts when they will eventually inevitably come up. Not if he is this triggered and closed-minded from seeing them portrayed on screen. Not if he's not willing to acknowledge the risk that he'd face that if he did have kids, and God forbid something happened to him, they too would be left on their own to face the world without him. And especially not if his only solution to cope with this is to write about families being well, even more abusive and mean-spirited to each other than most any other cartoon relationships he's railed against. Again, I've tried to speak up about Mr. Enter on some of his takes, but after his complete and total dismissal to any and all criticisms levied against his Nikorama series, including my own, even going so far as to say that the reactions towards his Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles review only made him proud to hate the show, I gave up on him. I still had a lot to say about him, but it became clear to me that he simply did not care anymore about what anyone else had to say, even if they did have his best interests in mind, so he simply was just not worth my time anymore. I became just as convinced as the rest of the world that the only real passion the guy was capable of was being passionately angry, and his announcement later that year that he ended his admirable animation series only further cemented that in my mind. When I would bring him up in subsequent videos, using him as an example of handling controversy poorly, I've had people tell me that he's been improving, but then came along his infamous turning red take and his meltdown on Twitter that followed. And from there I could only turn my nose up at anything he would say, and one of the things that convinced me that he was beyond the point of no return was his tweet, where he literally said that he was never going to shut up despite his own good. To use his own words, what he did was wrong, he knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway. Even with any videos that came up later, I was still convinced that any form of redemption for him was too little too late. So what if he made a follow-up to his Turning Red video saying he was sorry for his dumb take? You can't follow up a take like that with a barrage of nasty tweets, even casually bringing up how you've done worse things prior, and hand-wave that all away with a quick little "I'm sorry." So what if he has started back up his admirable animation series? It would only be a matter of time before he decides to discontinue it again because being a cynic is easier and gets more clicks. I've been trying so hard to ignore him and try to forget that he existed. I knew I couldn't do the latter entirely, as he had a big influence in my life and he did help shape a lot of who I've become today. But I just had to do my best to say, I got some benefit from having him in my life, but that's all in the past now. It did genuinely hurt me to see him go down the path he was going. As a guy who had autism and who inspired me in so many ways, as someone who had the potential to leave a positive legacy, it was just so sad seeing this be what he would amount to. But there was just something of me that couldn't shake that particular gnawing feeling inside me for whatever reason. Whatever little voice was trying to tell me, I decided to give a watch to his video called Hi, It's Me, and my feelings towards him have softened quite a lot after that. One of the things he mentioned in that video is that he's found out he has obsessive-compulsive disorder. Now, I don't know if I myself have OCD, I've never gotten a diagnosis for it, but looking at the symptoms for it, I can definitely identify what it's like to have it. I know that I have anxiety for sure, but OCD is certainly a horrific thing to be stuck with. He said that he promised himself at a very young age he would never even consider ending his life early, and that takes a lot of strength to commit to that, to stand by that. Already, after all, everything he's already have to endure through his childhood, and especially into adulthood when he's faced no shortage of harassment and death threats throughout his online career. He said he wants to be a better person than the way he's been acting, but he's leaving time to prove it. And I'd say that's a wise decision. That is really the only true determining factor of whether someone has really turned over a new leaf. And the fact that he recognized this, even if it does ultimately prove to be just talk, does show me that he's retained at least some modicum of humility. However, there are a few things that he brings up in his video that I want to debunk. First is him saying that his last interactions with both his mother and his great-grandmother. This seems so surreal that it's the only kind of thing that happens in books. This isn't really a criticism, I just felt compelled to point out that things like this can only happen in books because someone somewhere in real life had experienced it. Every piece of fiction derives or originates from some source of reality in some way or another. But next is him saying, don't be sorry, be better, and that an apology video is about asking for forgiveness. Making an apology isn't about asking for forgiveness. It's about coming forth and admitting your wrongdoings and trying to make amends for them, even while recognizing that others have every right not to forgive you. A real apology is about being honest with yourself, which is the first step to being better. As goes another classic saying, the best form of apology is changed behavior. Actions speak louder than words, after all. And finally is him openly wondering, both in that video and his worst Mr. Enter videos video, why his turning red take was the one that blew up and when he did worse things prior. Something I still don't believe shows as much maturity and self-awareness as he seems to think it does. Whatever the case for his video blowing up, his turning red video blowing up, that is, this is the internet. The internet is just as unpredictable as mankind's nature, and, well, that's exactly why it's important to be extremely careful what you say and own up to your mistakes as they come up. The turning red take might not have been John's most outlandish take of all, but all I can say is that he did have it coming for some time. If you get continuously dismissive of any and all criticism levied at you, it's only a matter of time before it spells your ultimate downfall. And whatever random stupid thing you do or say that makes you a target will only be made worse by you bringing up your past sins without being repentant about it. I remember John saying in his 2016 Powerpuff Girls video, Powerpuff Girls reboot that is, that one thing he's learned over the years is that the arguments that are most important to listen to are not the ones that intrigue you or even the ones that scare you, but the ones that bore you. Maybe now's a good time to reconsider that philosophy. For this reason, I do genuinely hope John gets better. And where I stand on this I regard this as an instance of I forgive but I can't forget. People whom I felt left down by can eventually come around in their own time, but that doesn't mean I automatically owe it to them to keep them around in my life. I have no intention of returning to Mr. Enter right now. I've decided 5 years ago, ironically about as long as I've been an active user on YouTube, that I haven't gained much from watching his later content, and an even bigger reason I've unsubbed from him is that it's become clear to me that nothing I have to say about him will affect him, or even be heard by him. But really, it's not my words he needs to trust. He needs to decide for himself what he wants to do with his life and who he cares to listen to. Only he can decide what's best for himself and what he wants to make of his life. For right now, I believe that he's passed through the rut he's found himself in during the pandemic, and I feel remorse for him for having lost his great-grandmother and his own mother on the same day, and that was probably the biggest wake-up call that he needed. I'm glad that the events that have happened to him have helped him sober up, and I hope that he continues to sober up. I hope that he gets the help he needs in overcoming his OCDs and the other mental issues he has in his life. John is in his 30s now, and if by some miracle he is watching this video and has made it up to this point, and if even more miraculously than that, I just want to say that even though I've long since stopped being into his content, I'm hoping that he's able to continue moving forward and making the best version of his life that he can, and getting the help that he needs, and even being able to make his ideas for growing around series a success, if what he says is true about how he's been reworking it from earlier drafts and that it's no longer what audiences initially perceived it to be. When he described in his Hi, It's Me video about how he went to visit his great-grandmother, essentially his godmother, during the last few minutes of her life, and how his ride back home with his mother thereafter was the last he ever saw of her before she died of overdose, I couldn't help but be reminded of Hans Christian Andersen, who was very close to his mother, and whose inspiration for The Little Match Girl was based on how his own mother had to collect what little she could out in the streets before going back home and getting beaten by her father if she came home empty-handed. So I figured if a figure like Andersen could find recognition and success out of these trials and hardships, maybe John can too. So that brings me to one thing I want to end this video on, having it be about more than just Mr. Enter. There is something to be said that whatever energy you radiate out into the world is the energy that comes right back to you. For a person to be able to redeem themselves or to rise above whatever suffering they've gone through and not turn into a complete asshole, they need to maintain the attitude that there is more to life and to their personality than just their suffering. Contrary to what John has said in his video about how animated films where the characters seem to be totally unaffected by the loss of their parents, those characters are affected. And in fact, a lot of them come from creators who have experienced such things for themselves. They do suffer and they do hurt. They just decide they don't want that pain to take away their will to live, and they want to make the best of the rest of their lives. You know why? Because nobody wants to engage with a story where the main character just gives up and dies in a hole or spends the rest of their lives being a miserable pill. That goes for real people, too. The most famous inspirational people, after stories about their lifelong suffering have become known to the public, still only resonate with people because they didn't give up. Because they wanted to be more than somebody who can only say, I am the shit that happens to me. Even if they've been subject to things like bullying, harassment, abuse, and or loss of a parent, or whatever else you can think of. One example I can think of is Judy Garland. Her life and all the trials she's faced have been well documented. How she was shamelessly mistreated and exploited for her talents by the studio system. How she was prescribed all these amphetamines and barbiturates that messed up her long-term health, both physically and mentally. How she spent her final years practically broke before dying from overdose at age 47. And indeed, she was very vocal about how difficult her life has been, even when she was young. Her father, Frank Gum, whom she said was her biggest champion when she was a child, passed away when she was only 13. This made even worse by her being left in the care of her mother, Ethel, whom she went on record to refer to as the real Wicked Witch of the West. But as vocal as Judy has been about her life of stardom was not all the glamour that everyone thought it would be, she would also say that she didn't regard her life as much a tragedy as the media like to make it out to be a lot of times. Even when bailing out of show business would have ensured her the best chance of saving her health, she stayed in it and remained connected to her audiences whom she loved just as much as they loved her, even going beyond the realm of show business, like being a prominent advocate for the queer community. She definitely tried to maintain an optimistic persona, not always a happy one, but not a bitter one, not a resentful one. She performed Somewhere Over the Rainbow in just about all her public appearances, not just because it was her most iconic song, but because she said that it had become part of her life. And she didn't want her suffering to be the main thing her children would remember her for either. Her relationship with them was troubled by combinations of her battles with addiction, her public image being constantly exploited, and her going through multiple marriages and numerous divorces. And as sad as they were when she passed away, they still said in the end that they were super proud of her and the legacy she left, and that they preferred to remember the happy times they had with her over the downer ones. So that brings me to the end of what I want to talk about here. I'm leaving Mr. Enter now, but I feel on better terms. I truly hope that he's able to make amends for real this time and better handle whatever the next controversy that comes up in his life may be. And if he wants to raise a family, that's one desire I won't try to deny him, but I will say that he needs to work on himself to make his life stable and mentally healthy as possible before he considers having kids. He can't just have a family in the hopes that they'll be the ones to bring him happiness or a sense of love that he never got from his own parents, save from his great-grandmother. We can bring other people into our lives to supplement us, but we can't rely on others to take our sadness away from us. And furthermore, he needs to be ready to be the best possible example to lead by as a person before he's ready to be a family man, or even continuing as a prominent figure on YouTube. And I dearly hope that he is able to do that for real this time. Regardless of whether or not I choose to follow him, I hope he can still turn things around. He can still turn things around for himself at this point. And well, that's where I'm leaving off for now. And until next time, I wish you the best, Mr. Enter.